Welcome back, everybody. It's 4:30 in the afternoon here in the UK, which means that it is in fact afternoon tea time for us all here. I do hope you can all join me in a nice little afternoon cup of tea. I can tell you that the Vectric team will definitely already have their feet up, and they'll probably be having a biscuit as well and a nice cuppa. Even Todd, he'll be muttering something about Tim Hortons, but secretly he'll be having a really big mug of builder's tea. Oh, that's better, isn't it? Yeah, so with that fortification, we can take a little look at what we've got on for the next 35 to 45 minutes. So what I'm hoping to talk to you today about is photo VCarving. And it's going to be an advanced talk, really. We're going to go into depth. We're going to go below the kind of normal software sort of features that are exposed to you, to talk about the process behind the scenes, so that we can use that information to perhaps do some more interesting, or at least different types of approaches to the problem. Okay, so the other way you might think about this, and I hope it might be the case, is that this should be everything you wanted to know about VCarving photographs, but you were afraid to ask. Let's hope so anyway. Okay, so what's the talk going to involve? Well, we're going to start with just a very simple bit of background. So I'm going to, again, we'll try and keep the slides light, so I'll get straight into some demos, but we will just whiz through a basic VCarving example so that we all have a common starting point. Then I'm going to get into the sort of more interesting demos, I hope, where, having done that basic process, we are going to look at taking different sorts of patterns as the basis of our photo VCarving to try and produce some more intriguing sort of products and output. Then I'm going to go into Aspire. So up until that point, everything that you see will be doable in in VCarve Desktop or Pro, and then I'm going to move into Aspire to do something a little bit different, but using what we've learned in the previous demos, hopefully. And again, mostly this is about trying to give you some inspiration and some ideas for things you might try yourselves. I'm sure that you'll come up with some even more interesting versions of this than I have. Okay, and then we're going to come back to the slides, and I'm going to talk about how we get the best results in practice at the machining end for our photo VCarve strategies, and we'll do a quick summary just to go through what we've learned. So hopefully it's kind of a nice balance of things, and again, I'll try and make it demo heavy, not slide heavy. So the photo VCarving effect, well, what is it? Let's just establish the basics. Okay, in its simplest form, what we're talking about here is taking a VBit tool and then pushing it in different depths into the surface of the material. And because it's a VBit tool, that means that the width of the cut at the surface will vary with depth. Okay, and we can use that to our advantage, because if we make it the case that we cut deeper where we find an image is darker, what we're going to do is produce a raster pass where the cuts will be wider at the darker parts of the image and narrower at the lighter parts of the image. And that means that if we make the cuts a different color from the surface, then you're going to reproduce the photograph on the surface of material. Okay, so that's hopefully you all kind of understand that. For those of you who are as old as me, my kids have no idea what I'm talking about when I say it's a little bit like newspaper print used to be when they did photographs using different dot sizes. Okay, so we're going to use width of cut in the same way. Okay, so again, what I want to do in this case is not spend loads of time on the kind of vanilla process. I want to get onto some understanding that process just enough that we can move beyond it. So I do want to point you at the fantastic video that Becky did when we introduced photo VCarving as a strategy in its own right in version 10. So up until that point, you were perfectly able to do photo VCarving in Aspire by doing a series of manual steps, some of which we're going to cover now. But it wasn't really available through VCarve Pro and Desktop. We had an independent product called Photo VCarve, which did that strategy and was dedicated to that strategy. And we were able to move some of that technology into VCarve Desktop and Pro, and also improve some of the things that we've done as well at the same time. But like I say, I do recommend you get yourself over to the YouTube tutorial set, find the photo VCarving strategy tutorial, and Becky will take you through every single setting on that form, which I'm not going to do in this talk. Okay, so it's demo time. Hopefully I shall impress you more than I impressed the Queen when I showed her these. The first demo is, we're just going to set the scene. So I'm going to do a basic example of VCarving so that we can talk through what the vanilla sort of process looks like. Then, though, I'm going to move quite quickly onto using some patterns that are more sophisticated and then try and thematically link them. We're going to talk about what structures of patterns work and why, and then look at some ways we can replace the boring old raster stripes with something perhaps a little bit more striking. Then I'm going to do a sort of change of mode completely. Then we're going to go into Aspire. We're going to take what we've learned about the photo VCarving strategy, and then we're actually going to do something quite different in Aspire using a model instead of a photo. So hopefully, again, it's just sort of suggesting to you an alternative technique that might turn out to be handy in some cases and make you think about some alternative ways of creating effects on the surface of your models in Aspire. Okay. So straight over to the demos then. Let's start with my basic VCarving demo. So what I have here is just a standard photograph. We're in VCarve Pro, but this would work in desktop just as well. All I want to point out at this stage is this is a sort of a good opportunity to talk about what photos work well. So what we're looking for really for a good effect, to be honest, is always going to be a high contrast image. If you've got subtlety of shading, it's often going to be lost. So you want a good high contrast image with a lot of distinction between the dark and the light areas in your image. Don't forget, you've got tools now in the latest version of the software which allow you to adjust your picture. You can change the contrast and brightness in situ as well as crop it, as I showed yesterday. So you can just tweak your image, try and get the brightness up, contrast up, so you've got good dark and light areas which are well separated. Then we just really come across to this new toolpath strategy here on the right. Whoops, photo VCarve strategy on the right here. This is, like I say, added since version 10, and it's in VCarve Desktop, Pro, and Aspire. If we select that, let's just have a quick whiz down. Like I say, I'm not going to go into massive detail, but I do want to point out I'm going to do some very fine cuts here. So we're only going to go 1 millimeter into the surface. Photo VCarving is all about fine depths of cut, and we'll talk a bit later on about what challenges that's going to bring you in terms of practicalities. But really a couple of millimeters, some few small fractions of an inch, that's all you're going to do. I'm going to use a 60, in fact, let's not use a 60, let's in fact use a 90-degree VBit for reasons which I will explain in a second. I'll stick with imperial units though, half-inch VBit tool, 90 degrees. I'm going to raster it across the surface. Now then, I want to come back and just talk about this line spacing. So in the strategy, we have tried to take away any maths that you need to worry about. So this, if you just want to do straightforward photo VCarving, this is straightforward slider bar that deals with the maths of taking you from a dense pattern to a sparse pattern that will still broadly work in nearly every occasion. But in order for us to progress this talk, I want to just go a little bit beneath the surface and say, well, what do we mean by that? When why are we presenting that in percentage terms and not in absolute units? Okay, what does 100% density mean? Okay, and to understand that, we just do need to pop back in and think a little bit about what the VCarving effect is doing. Okay, so we're plunging the tool in to the material, and what we want to know, and we've given it a maximum depth. Remember, I put in 1 millimeter. Now what we want to know is how much do we need to step across these passes to get a dense picture reproduction or a sparse one. Okay. In other words, what we want to look at here is this is kind of the minimum that we're going to ever step across, because at this point, the next pass of this tool, if you imagine the cut width here is going to exactly butt up against the cut width from the previous pass. In other words, you are maximally cutting away the surface of the material. If you cut any closer to this, you're actually cutting deeper into the material, but you're getting no surface difference there because you've already maximized the amount of the surface you can cut away with this tool. Because otherwise you're just starting to overlap with the previous cut. Okay, so this is what we call 100%. So when you're using that slider and you're down at the dense end, we're saying that 100%, that is as tightly packed as you want your raster lines to ever be for a photo VCarving effect. You can space them out as much as you like, and the slider takes you up to 400, or 4 times that. 400%, or indeed you can type in anything you like and extend it even further. You can actually type in some values lower than this as well, I believe, but what I'm getting at really is that if you're going below, then you're going to get some weird kind of undefined effects where you start to intersect and overlap those cut paths, right, which remember are kind of a 3D shape. So that's what we mean by the 100% to density to sparseness on the form. But what are the general principles here? Where are those values coming from? Well, we're calculating them on the fly in the form to save you having to do any maths, because that distance, that 100% distance in real units, is really down to the geometry of your tool. Okay, so when you cut into the material, as we say, there is a width change. There's a width of cut associated with that depth of cut, but it's different for each tool. Right, so for a 90, 60 or 45 degree tool, you're going to get a different value. And so you're going to need a bit of trigonometry to work out what your best optimal spacing is. And that's what we're doing behind the scenes for you on that strategy to keep it simple. So for normal strategies, that's fine. But we do need to understand it for this, because I'm going to try and create my own patterns where I don't have the assistance of our raster pattern creator, if you like. So we do need to understand what spacings will work. Okay, so my rules of thumb are pretty simple. The first thing is, if you've got a 45 degree tool, the trig is easy. The width of the cut you're going to get will exactly match whatever depth you've pushed it into. So if you imagine your max depth of cut, which is what it's going to be for black on an image, that max depth of cut will exactly match the width of the line. And so the spacing between the lines will tend to be whatever your max depth of cut is, okay, for a 45 degree VBit tool. For a 90 degree, you're going to get a width that's twice the depth. Okay, so if you're going down to 1 millimeter deep, then in fact your width of cut with a 90 will be 2 millimeters wide, and that's the sort of spacing that you'll need to look for to get the equivalent of our 100% density spacing. And then 60s, right, you either reach for the calculator like I do, or I reach for Adam or one of the dev team, or I just guess that 60 must be somewhere between the depth and twice the depth. You know, so every value between 45 and 90, I just take a bit of a guess, because at the end of the day, it's an aesthetic, and that will get you a long way there. But yeah, you can reach the calculator if you want a bit of precision at this point. Okay, so that's worth understanding, because we're going to use that in a minute when we start creating our own patterns. Okay, so back to the product. Okay, so over to VCarve again. We've created, I think we now know that this density of 100% for a 90 degree VBit is actually going to be spacing of 2 millimeters apart. We understand where that's come from now. I've set a line angle of 45 degrees. I nearly always change the angle of a photo VCarve from horizontal to vertical, because it sort of breaks up the pattern of it. So let's just fire that one up and just take a look at it. Okay, so there's the pattern. Nothing too surprising there. You can see it's dipping in and out of the surface as it goes along the rasters. The spacing between these, we would find if we were to measure them, would be 2 millimeters in the darkest areas. That matches the, as we just discussed, that's going to be twice of that maximum depth. You'll see that the strategy is quite clever, so it doesn't bother any sort of air moves where it knows you're not going to intersect the surface. So these are areas which are essentially white, or within tolerance they're white, so it's removed them all quite nicely. Let's just play it back and have a look at that on the preview. So I shall just preview this selected one. Okay, and that's going to carve away the surface for us maximally 1 millimeter deep into our piece of material. Now, there's a couple of things to point out while that's doing that. One is that I have cranked up the resolution of my preview material, and I do that over here under toolpaths. You can actually set the preview simulation quality to be right up to maximum. I mean, 25 times slower that is literally true. So any calculations you're doing will really slow down as you start to hammer the resolution up. But it's worth going up a bit higher than standard for these because you're making fine cuts on the surface and you want to zoom in and have a look at them. You won't see the detail as much unless you've got the pixel points there, if you like, to represent that cut cleanly. So that's what it looks like. I have to also point out to you, this is an extremely flattering view of a VCarving toolpath. Because of our 3D shading, we tend to accentuate massively shadows. When you cut into material like just a plain wood, or certainly a light colored wood like this, you're going to end up with a very indistinct result. If I twiddle this around so the lighting is a little bit less helpful, that's actually more what it's going to look like when you carve it. You're not going to have a great deal of natural light that just makes the grooves dark. So you're going to want to stain those grooves. And again, we'll talk about that in the second part of this talk when we go back to slides. But for now, it's worth knowing that you can simulate that by using this toolpath color option on your toolpath to select a dark color similar to the stain that you're going to use when you finish. And of course, that will make the whole image pop for you and you're getting a better view of what it actually might look like when it's stained all cleanly or painted up. Okay, so that's our basics. It's pretty good, isn't it, right? So I'm not going to diss it anyway. It's a great strategy, but let's see if we can make it slightly more interesting. So the first thing I'm going to do is take you back here and to point out that we can actually, instead of rastering or hatching the surface with automated kind of pattern generation, we can actually use any pattern that we generate ourselves. And that's really going to be the key to the rest of this talk. And I'm going to start with the simplest pattern of all. If I just close that down, we go back to 2D view. I'm just going to use our vector texture creator tool up here, which allows us to fill an area with waves, basically. And I'm going to take the basic setting here. We're going to say the angle's 30 degrees, 35, 30, 40 degrees, something like that. I've chosen 30 actually because it sort of matches the slope that's in the background of my scene here. So it will kind of pull out something from the image which is actually aligned with that, which might be quite nice. The spacing, right? So this is the key where we come back to that discussion I had earlier. How do you pick the spacing? Well, you've got to think about what tool you're using. In my case, we're going to use a 90-degree VBit. So we know we're getting to a maximum cut depth of 1 millimeter, which means the cut line at that deepest point, the black areas on this train will be 2 millimeters wide. So if I space it at 2 millimeters or a bit more than 2 millimeters, then that will give me a very solid idea about how dense the result's going to be. 2.5 mil means that there will always be slightly lighter, even over the darkest areas of the image, there'll be some light surface material still between the raster passes, and it'll give us some contrast. So, but that's where you're picking that number from, and you'll have to play with it, but at least I'm giving you the ballpark starting position for it. I'm going to put some waves in, amplitude 5 mil. This is just fairly arbitrary stuff to play with. Wavelength, quite long waves, small amplitude. No noise for this, and I'm going to put it on a layer, but I'm not going to call it noisy wave. I'm going to call it simple wave. It helps if the thing goes under layer, just for selection later on. There we go, simple sine wave pattern, repeating at 2.5 mil spacing. So we'll go back into our photo-vcarve now. And instead of the raster pass, I'm going to select the vectors, shift to select the new vector pattern. So the image is still selected as well. And let's calculate that. Reset our preview and take a look. So you can see it's really pretty similar to what we had before. It's still quite an efficient toolpath. That will be still really fast because you've got a series of connected lines with very few air moves. So it's going to be quite efficient. What does it look like? That's the big question. Yeah, it's pretty pleasing, right? So it's taken, it's still holding the image well. It's put a bit of visual interest into the pattern. So it's got a stylized feel to it. It's kind of a bit different now from the original one, but for certain situations, you could imagine that gives it a certain extra pizzazz and a bit of a punch. Let's try though to adjust that pattern again. So let's go back into our layers. I'm just going to hide the simple wave layer. Back to our drawing, sorry, here, and create another set of waves this time. All the same settings as we had before, but this time I'm going to crank this noise up. So this noise basically adds randomness to the spacing and the other properties to give us a sort of sense of a more naturalistic occurring pattern. And this is used extensively for people doing textured woods and wood paneling and things like that, or grain effects. Okay, but we're going to use it in this case just to produce something for our raster strategy. That still looks pretty plausible, doesn't it? Right? Did I remember to change the layer? Probably not. Right, so the photo VCarving, we'll open the photo VCarving again. I'm going to select the now the noisy pattern. Okay, so the noisy pattern is still broadly the same stuff. Calculate that. So you think, yeah, this could be good, right? So it's going to be adding a little bit more of naturalistic feel to things. Play it back. Now I have screwed this up because I've gone and included. I knew I'd screwed that up. Sorry about that, everyone. So what I did there was I managed to put it all on the same layer, having told you I wasn't going to do that early on. So let's stop and get rid of that. Do it again. Apologies. Looks messy though, doesn't it? That's a bit of a giveaway from what I'm going to say in a second, but let's just get rid of that. So what I did there, in case you're wondering, is I put everything on this noisy wave. I thought I did anyway, didn't I? Let's get rid of that. Ah, that's where I put it. And start that again. So this time we'll go in, same again, I'll make sure that I give it its own pattern, noisy thing, preview, and it's definitely on its own layer now. And we can go back into our thing, select that, and make sure we select the image as well. Whoops, select the image and the pattern. Oh. Come on, there we go. Select the image and the pattern. Okay, so what I was going to get at here is that we might think that this was going to be quite a pleasing kind of outcome because we've just added a bit of organic sort of naturalistic variance into the pattern. But in fact, I think you'll agree that it's not great. It's quite rough, actually. You've lost a lot of the image of the train. You can't see what's going on at all. Why is that? Well, really, there's two reasons why this approach to creating your own patterns is going to be problematic. The first is that the more structure, typically, that you give your source raster pattern, if you like, the more that's going to distract the eye and the brain from the underlying image that you're trying to create. So you're going to have a conflict here and a competition between the image and the structure of the pattern on top. So you've got to be careful about that. But the other thing, I think it's more important, and we will test this theory in a second, is patterns where you've added variation in density are really problematic because the density variation starts to alias against the depth of cut. So you're going to get darker areas simply because you've got more packed vectors rather than because you're correctly reproducing the photograph. So I think more of a problem we're seeing here is that this is a classic example of something where you've got variable density vectors to start with. So I think that's to be avoided. Let's move on now and talk about, though, what we can do to still produce perhaps effective, complex patterns which don't detract from the image in the same way. So let's have a quick look at that example. So for this one, in fact, I'm going to just start a completely fresh model, which I'm going to use our new template system for those of you following on from the What's New yesterday. So I've got various templates set up with different material sizes. In this case, I've got landscape A4. So for those of you in the US, the A4 is a standard paper size, metric paper size in UK and Europe. It's broadly equivalent to the US letter size. But for us, it's quite handy because often you get small pieces. For small machines, you'll get acrylic sheet or laminate panels in this size. So I'm going to start with one of those. Nice thing about the template system is it's set up all my origins. In this case, I quite like the origin in the center. I can always move that when I come to machine it, but it's nice from a design perspective, sometimes for mirroring and symmetry. Now I need a source image. So my source image, I am going to use a film shot from 1948 film with Laurence Olivier playing Hamlet. Crucially, so I'm going to grab this image in just off a Google Images search. Obviously, if you want to use this stuff commercially, you need to be looking very carefully at the copyright issues associated with any particular file that you use off the internet. I'm providing it purely for demonstration purposes, okay? So the copyright issues you'd have to explore for yourself. All right, demonstration-wise though, it's a nice image for the same reasons we mentioned before. It's got great contrast. Another thing I didn't mention earlier is the background is nicely blurred away. If you have an image with a strong structured background, as well as the foreground, that will often get lost when you do the VCarving. And so it's quite nice to either remove a background or blur it out. If you have Photoshop skills, then you can lasso select your main thing and blur away the background, and that will produce a nicer photo VCarving portrait as well. In this case, it's all been done for me, so that's nice. But what am I going to use as the pattern? Well, since this is Hamlet and we're going to make a poster for the play, I have got the soliloquy from Hamlet that I've just got off the internet. So I've got this off the open sort of source classical literature archive. And what I've done though that's a little bit unusual is I've kind of packed it together. So I've removed the original new lines and line breaks, and I've packed the text together. So the line breaks are now all over the place. I don't care where they are in terms of text. What I care about is that I've got a block of broadly even length sentence, line lengths. Okay, so I'm not worrying about how it should read at this point. And that's going to make life a lot easier when I bring this in to my text tool, drop it into the text box here. So I've just Control-C, Control-V. We're going to choose something a little bit more, say, I don't know, Shakespeare-y. So I'm going to use Apple Chancery, which I think is a standard font. And it doesn't really matter about the actual font height for me, because what really matters is I'm going to drag this around anyway and use the scaling dynamically. Okay, so what I want to make sure of is primarily here that the text is not overflowing the edges of the image. That's all I'm interested in. We need to make sure that the bits we carve are going to be on the image broadly. So we can even expand this image to be bigger than the area that we're actually planning to machine, because as I say, it's all about the stylistic result. Okay. So grow that in there. So that looks good. That's going to capture the majority of that image, I would say. But it's not dense and it's very structured. Okay, so how we can improve that so we don't get that effect where we had before of variable density detracting from the image? Well, I'm going to use the offset tool. This is such a powerful tool in our software. And we're going to just use that to offset our text out. How far are we going to offset out? Well, going back to my original slides, we just need to think about what tooling we're going to use. If I'm going to use a 90-degree VBit, I need to offset out by 2 millimeters. Or in this case, I think I'm going to go with a 60-degree VBit. So we need to go somewhere, if you remember, between the maximum cut depth of 1 and if say a maximum cut depth of 1, we're going to need to think about line spacing of between 1 and 2. Okay, so I'm going to go with 1. That's going to be okay for a 60-degree. And calculate. That's going to take a little time. You might get warnings at this point, depending on your fonts. There might be all sorts of horror stories in fonts. There usually is to do with overlaps and intersections and stuff. Now, one of the nice things about the VCarving effect that we're going to do is it's pretty robust in the face of those things. So if you get a warning that we're doing here, this isn't, although we're calling it photo VCarving, it's not like the VCarve strategy. It drives the tool along the line. It doesn't try and find regions between the lines like the VCarve strategy has to. So although they're named similarly, actually the maths that underpins them is quite different. And this strategy, the photo VCarve strategy, is really quite robust in the face of intersections and overlaps and all that sort of stuff that you have to worry about when you're trying to define a region as opposed to just a line. Okay, so you can safely ignore most of those and it will still work okay if you get a warning, because fonts are bad for that. So what I've done is offset 1, but I had that select new set. So now the thing I've offset is now the current selection, which means I can offset it again and again and again. So now I'm offsetting all the way out and packing the space between the text with offsets of that text. I'm just going to come back, select the original text again and offset it out by 10. I want to get a border around this to cut the part out when I'm finished. So I'm just going to offset it all out now by 10 mil to get a border. I want the border to sort of broadly trace the path of the text, because what I'm looking for here is a sort of parchment-like feel, you know, a rough-edged sign. You can see it's really good because it captures this perfectly, but I want it to be a bit smoother than that. And a top tip I think we've talked about before is if I offset that out again and then offset it back inwards and just keep the last one of those, you can see that last offset in has broadly smoothed the vector a little bit. So we've just taken out some of those edges. It's just a quick way of starting to smooth out a vector that's been pulled from other geometry. Okay, so that's it really. Close that down. Let's just tickle it all up so it's kind of centered inside the job. It's all relative to the image, so we don't need to worry too much about that. Okay, that's it. I'm going to come back now to our photo VCarve strategy. We've got selected vectors, max carve depth. Let's choose the 60-degree VBit this time. And what I'm going to do is select all, Control A to select everything. I haven't put stuff on layers, so I've been a bit lazy. So I'm going to select everything, hold down the Shift key and reselect the boundary, which we don't want. Okay, and holding down the Shift key, select the photo, which we do want. And that was just a quick way of kind of doing everything, getting everything except the boundary. Okay, selected vectors, max, yeah, that's it. Let's do it. Okay, so this one is now going to be a much more intensive toolpath, no doubt about that. Lots and lots of segments, so lots of air moves, unfortunately, but the effect, hopefully, will be worth it. Okay, so with that tool selected, that's 60 degree, we can carve in here and pull out the image using the text. So hopefully you'll see this as I turn the color on that we mentioned earlier. This will really pop. Okay, so here you can see the effect of a sign. What we've got is really complex, densely packed data for the raster, but this time it's not detracted at all from the image because it's even, because we used the offsetting and we didn't really muck around with the space to which it's pretty even, and so that works okay. Obviously, as you get closer to the sign, people will start to make out that it is also cunningly made up of the text from the play itself. So hopefully you can think of sort of lots of areas where this sort of approach might be quite cool. And what I'm going to do now is skip over and do a slightly more sophisticated version of this as well. So that's the first of those, just using the simplest approach, bring in the text, offset it consistently, and use that as your raster. In the next example, which I have preloaded, I've used a portrait. Again, this is a Creative Commons portrait. It's the one off the Wikipedia page for Muhammad Ali. So I've just dragged that straight in. Again, it's Creative Commons license, but it is copyright, so you need to be aware of your copyright issues if you want to go commercial with any of this stuff. It's just for demos. Okay, the other aspect then with Muhammad Ali, that unlike Shakespeare, he was not big on writing whole books, as far as I'm aware, but he did come up with a shed load of really, really pithy quotes. Okay, so the text we're going to associate with him is actually going to be lots and lots of, it's very fragmented. So it's a slightly different problem for us to deal with. What I've done there is I found on USA Today a 30 of his best quotes. Right, so this is just laid out for us quite nicely. I've cut and pasted those out of the website and just cleaned up the quotes into plain text so that we can sort of pick out the quotes that we're after. Now, what I want to do is just show you how I went about processing just one of these quotes, and then we'll skip and see the end result. So the quote that I want to use here is this: impossible is not a declaration, it's a dare. Impossible is potential, it's temporary, it's nothing. Right, so let's take a copy of that. So just Control C on the keyboard, over to the text tool, just plop it somewhere on the side here so we can see what we're doing. And I'm just going to paste that in. This time we don't want Shakespearean font, we want something a bit punchier, if you'll excuse the expression. And I'm going to use this extra bold stuff, but you can see everything's coming on one line. So do you remember I was having to work out how to process the text before and I didn't show you that step? Well, the same problem occurs here. You want to really start thinking about how you want this text to be split onto its own lines. So I'm going to take every sentence initially and just break those up onto their own line in the text tool. So I'm just selecting the end of each sentence and pressing return. I can get rid of the full stops or the period. So in there, we don't want those from a stylistic point of view, they're not necessary. And what we've also got, I think, is this word impossible repeated down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a single copy of that, and we're going to try to make some sort of word art to repeat usage of that. So I'm just going to put that on its own line and get rid of the other ones that we don't need. So I'm just looking at the whole phrase as a structured block. So the plan is going to be, I'm going to really pack this text, but it's going to be a series of these phrases. Text alignment to the left this time. I'm not worried about it being centered. and that'll do. Again, I'm not worried about the size because we're going to muck around with it all in situ here. So the plan here is I want to pack all this down into a little square region that we can add to all the other text areas also packed down like that. And I'm going to rotate them and generally do something more interesting than just straightforward lines across the screen. This is where I want to highlight a really cool tool. It's hidden away, and one of those things where in the moment when you need it, it's the best tool ever. Okay, and that is because I want to split these lines up now, and I want to deal with them all as independent bits of text, so I can adjust their size, or potentially you might want to split them down onto a different bit of a curve, or you want to change the font or something. We have this right-click option to break text blocks into lines, and it does exactly what it says in the tin. So when I select that, the text block now has become, these are now all individual little text blocks. Okay, so if you've cut and paste content in like I did, you can get it in here and then break it out. Now this means it has everything's independent now, so that's quite nice. So I'm going to take the impossible bit at the top here, and the first thing I'm going to do is rotate this one round to form a side kind of vertical strip of text. As I rotate this, I'm going to hold the Alt key down on my keyboard, and that forces the rotation to snap in increments, 15-degree increments, so that I can get exactly a 90-degree increment. Notice it's still text, so there's no problems with this now. Our text, if you transform it, move it around, it still remains as text. With these other ones, I want to really pack them closer, so I want to kern them together. So I want to remove and minimize the spacing both between the words and in some cases between the letters, so that they're more densely packed than they would normally be for reading. And we'll get away with that because, again, it's an artistic pattern we're creating, not something that's meant to be closely or conveniently read. It's meant to be, in fact, a little bit enigmatic, where you have to spend a bit of time working out what each block says. So I'm using the Edit Spacing and Curve tool, again, a really powerful text editing tool. When I select that, you can see that my icons are changing. They're really massive. Hopefully you can see them a bit better today. I've tried to enlarge them since we got asked yesterday if we could make our mouse pointers a bit bigger. And if I just click, you can see it starts to move the word spacing together. If I'm between letters, then it will move the letters together. Now, two top tips are, if I press the Shift key, it pushes them apart instead of moving them together. And if I press the Control key, it does it in bigger bytes, which is really handy when you need that. So I'm going for it so that this is quite tightly packed, and I'm not worrying at all about the fact that it has to be particularly easily readable. What I really want is a dense pattern. So just whiz down these and kern them all out. So I'm just holding the Control key to give me big jumps. Here as well, we can see in between these letters, so I just move between the letters and click it again, and I can just bring that up. Okay, so they're already now looking a little bit denser for us to use. Come out of the text tool now, and I'm going to shrink these individual sizes down a little bit so that we can start to pack the text in. And this is just one of those things you're going to do by eye. Just bring them all out to be the same width, basically. So bring them up as tight as I can, and then use just our normal scale tools just to correct their width slightly so that it starts to look more sign-like. And hopefully you can see this is kind of, our text tools are kind of really neat for this sort of thing, because you can swap between them being text and then just also straightforward drawing entities really trivially. Okay, so the whole block is done. A top tip when I do that, if I, hopefully everyone knows, if you select by dragging left to right, you will only select things that are completely enclosed in the block. So in this case, I only enclosed it. If you drag from right to left, you'll select anything you touch. That's really handy. It's a little bit obscure, but it's the most useful fact. So everyone should definitely know that. And then we're going to just stretch that so it's all matching up roughly. Okay, so that's me packed the text out. I want to just emphasize again that this is still all text. So here, you may have noticed that there's a bit of a kerning error in the text, but because we haven't converted any of this to curves, we were able to do all this stuff now just while it's still in text form. That means I can come back and just sort out that spacing. So remember, if I hold down the Shift key, we can push letters apart as well as move them closer together so that we can sort that out. So that's it. So that's basically one block of text, which I would now drop into the image. And what I want to do is just cut to the chase and show you that I've already done that, pretty much filled the image. So again, you can spend as much time on this as you'd like. I just want to show you the principle so I haven't gone mad with it. The other part of the principle I want to show you is just now when we used the text previously, we just offset it outwards. So it continued to broadly have the form of the outer boundary of the text. But I want to remind you as well that if we bring in a fixed boundary, so in this case we might want to cut this into a perfect plaque with filleted corners, we can also use the offset to blend between our artwork as well. So if I select the text and I select the boundary, and we come back into our offsetting here, and I ask it to offset inwards, that might seem a little bit, so before we were offsetting the text out, but now we've selected a boundary and the text, we want to offset inwards from both towards one another. Okay, so we're offsetting inwards. Again, what distance? Well, we know the basic rule now. So with a 90-degree VBit, if we're going to cut 1 mil in, we need to be thinking about 1 mil spacing. And let's offset that in. So again, this is really kind of powerful, this offsetting tool. So it fills that space for us nicely. Let's get rid of that. Well, that causes me some future trouble. Okay, and that's my text boundary. Now notice, of course, it's kind of blended it as it goes into form the text boundary, so you get a transition into your fixed cutout boundary. That's it really. Let's do the finale, which is, I said 90 degree, didn't I? I meant 60. So max carving depth of 1 mil, selected vectors, which is all that lot, and the picture, hold down Shift and press that, calculate it. Okay, reset the preview. Let's have a quick look. Okay, and here you can see the finished parts. So in this case, what we've got here, we've got some large areas where we've allowed a lot of structure to stay in the image this time. But because it's thematically linked, it's not a problem. It's artistically interesting. So while you might want to choose, for example, with this large B in the middle here where it's over his eye, you might want to offset inwards from that text and you could make a dense pattern. But I actually stopped there because I quite like the fact that he's so famous for that "sting like a bee" quote that this is iconic straight away, and it actually it makes you realize immediately who this image is of. Okay, so that's a couple of examples where what we've done is just really look at the offsetting tools, starting with our texturing, vector texturing tools and our text tools to create some more interesting patterns. We've looked at how patterns work well as long as you maintain their density, and how good the software is at producing those sort of dense offset patterns. So I'm hoping, really, like I said, these are just ideas. I'm not expecting these to be the perfect end results by any means. What I'm expecting is that this time next year, at the next user group meeting, that I will hopefully see some fantastic, much more impressive projects. But hopefully I've at least gone on to stimulate the idea in somebody who's much more talented than me to take to new levels. Okay, so that's the end of the VCarve bit. I'm going to cut across now to Aspire, and what we're going to do is just take what we've learned on the photo VCarve pattern and just see what else we might be able to do now we understand that process a little bit more. So in Aspire, I've just knocked up some artwork here of a basic sign for the bar and lounge. It's the hypnosis bar. Do you see what I did there? I should be in marketing, I think. And so what we're going to do now is use this a model instead of a photograph as the basis of our depth varying control, and put a pattern over the top of that in Aspire. But this is one of those demos which is just basically easier to see than explain. So let's start by creating what's going to be the depth controlling mask as a component, and I'm going to do that in the simplest way possible. Select everything in the display, go to the modeling tab, select the shape. We are going to do a curve profile, 45 degrees, we are going to limit it, crucially, to a very, very tiny height. Okay, so I'm limiting it to a height, and notice that that height is very, very small, right? A 20th of an inch, okay? And the reason for that is because, remember, we're just dipping the tool in by just these small amounts, and this is going to control. That height will be the maximum depth that the tool actually dips in when we use it as a depth mask. Okay, so that's it really is that simple though. Just pop the text up, it's what we do well. Okay, close that down. And I want to just sort of smooth out the edges of this so we get nice, so that the VCarving is going to dip in and out of the surface nicely. So to do that, before I go any further, I'm going to add in a zero plane. Okay, so I'm just going to add in a plane underneath it into which we can smooth the text edges. Okay, so I'll just add that in, makes life a little bit easier on the eye. And then what I actually do is stop that for a second. I need to select both things together and smooth them into one another. It says, do you want to join them together for smoothing? Yes, I do. That's fine. And I want maximum smoothing. So I'm not very subtle with my smoothing. And that's fine. So now this model is kind of like our little Z controlling mask, okay, over which we're going to flow the VBit toolpath. Okay. We do need to set it now. Now, as always, once you create a 3D model, you just think about where it sits in the material block. So let's get that sorted out. So in the material block, I just want to ensure here that it's right at the top of the block. So no gap, it's right at the top of the block. Okay. If we look in our block material there, we can see it just sitting right under the surface. Okay, so that's that. Now we need a pattern to lay over the surface of, to actually use as our raster strategy. And to do that, it's asking me to just recalculate the cutout path. Excuse me, that's to save me a bit of time later. And so to do that, I'm going to use a gadget. Now, Mike's going to talk to you about gadgets tomorrow morning, how they're written and how you might go about getting one of your own. But they're also an opportunity for you to grab somebody else's work who's written them for us. So Vectric provides some really clever customers of ours have also provided several really useful ones, and one of those is the spiral gadget. So this isn't installed by default. You need to head over to gadgets.vectric.com and get the installer for it, and then you'll be able to add it to your copy, and then you'll be able to follow along this tutorial. If you're unsure about anything to do with gadgets, in the gadget menu, you can ask about gadgets themselves. So there's an About Gadgets gadget. Okay, and that will tell you a bit about them and provide you a link. But basically, you get onto the website and follow the links on gadgets, and you'll get all the instructions you need. So I'm going to use the spiral gadget. Pops up a little interface for me, asks me various things, including some very clever spiral types. I'm only interested in the Archimedes spiral, which is basically the simplest form of spiral. What I do need to work out is the width and times round values. They're a bit of a head scratcher, if I'm honest with you, but it seems to be that this will give me about 2 mil space, 0.2 inch spacing. This will give me, I think, when I worked it out. So yeah, it is what it seems like. You're talking about the total width of the spiral and then how many times round to get to the edge of that total width. So it's slightly hard to know what the spacing is. Somebody, I'm sure, will tell me that they have a formula for that, and it's easily done. So let's just apply it though for now. It appears in, and one for the dev team I've noticed is that we misspell spiral. It comes in on its own layer, but it's actually called spriel instead of spiral. Need to fix that. But we can grab that spiral now and drop it into the center. I'm going to use the center of the O as our nice kind of, yeah, this is kind of the, what would you call it, the aesthetically pleasing way that the spiral is going to spiral out from the center of the O. And what I need to do though is trim it back to the boundary. So with the spiral selected, I'm going to select, let's just drag that over, select the spiral here and this inner boundary. So I'm holding down the shift key to select the inner boundary. And I'm going to use this tool here to trim selected objects to the last selected object. So I've selected the spiral and the last selected object is the boundary. I want to clear outside of that boundary. So I just Click that, and it says refit the curves after clipping. Yes, thank you very much. But now they're all line segments, so I'm going to press G before I go any further so that they're grouped together and easier to handle. Okay, so that's my grouped spiral. Now then, this is going to be a bit unusual. We're not going to use the photo-vcarv tool in this case. We know enough to know how to get the same effect manually. So in this case, I'm actually going to use profile toolpath. Okay, but we're going to profile with a VBit tool. So I'll start off with something a bit unusual. We're going to start by having no start depth and no cut depth. A VBit tool, 90-degree VBit tool, we're going to machine on the vectors. And crucially, down here, we want to make sure we optimize the start points of those vectors. We're not caring about, this is effectively like slots. There's no, the climb and conventional milling is kind of fairly arbitrary. So we just want it to connect these segments efficiently to minimize the air moves and speed up the whole result. So optimize it, but that's it. So I'm just going to calculate that first of all, and let's have a quick look. So that's what it looks like. If we play it back, it's terribly unexciting because we got no depth. All right, so it has no depth. It's just a pattern over the surface. The magic happens, of course, when we select this option at the bottom to project the toolpath onto the 3D model. And remember, our 3D model is the hypnosis components we just created. So let's recalculate that now, projecting. And as I tilt this now, you should start to see that subtly, of course, we have changed the depth. We've pushed the flat toolpath down over the surface of our component. But remember all the things we've learned with a VBit tool. This means we're going to get wider and narrower cuts as we go. And so now this should give us an interesting effect. Broadly similar to the photo-vcarving that we've been discussing throughout. I'll just cut that sign out. There's that. And then make it bigger for you to take a look at. Okay, so it's an unusual approach. Okay, it's an unusual approach. So we've learned quite a lot of stuff here, haven't we? So this is just applying it now in a subtly different way to produce something a little bit different. And you may find that there might be something parallel that you've done that you could apply this technique to, or something similar. Anyway, over to you. I hope you find it as an interesting idea, at least, to use your components to drive VBit carving instead of sort of indirectly. Just to be clear again, if we want our spacing here for this tool, we can adjust that sort of depth of cut. It's really simple to do when you've got your head around what's really going on. If we want the tool to dive in deeper, we simply need to make our component a little bit bigger, right? So if we double the height of our component, i.e. the depth of our component, and we just close that down, take a look again at the material setup here. Now we've still got the material tucked to the bottom, but it's twice as big, our material, our component, and we just recalculate everything again. What we should get is, if we reset this, everything just cutting deeper and therefore darker. So now you know kind of how to play with this stuff. You hopefully will find that you can do real kind of interesting and controlled interactions here to produce the effects you're after. All right, so a much bolder version of the same sign because we've got in deeper, we've closed up the gap effectively between those cuts distances. All right, okay, good. We're on track, I think, maybe overrunning a wee bit. Back to the presentation. So we've talked about that. Now let's talk about materials contrast. So I'm going to whiz through this quite quickly, but there's a couple of top tips in here. Crucially, this effect only works if the surface is different in its color from the cuts. Right? There has to be contrast between the surface and the cuts. 4 main ways people achieve this. One is they're going to cut and stain. So you're just going to cut it and then you're going to just put a stain over it and you're going to allow the stain to settle into the cuts more than the surface and typically wipe it off the surface. That's simple and effective. Cut and paint, thicker paint. So yesterday, Matt Plumley was talking about how he did painting through VCarving through a stencil. So he was using a plastic sheet over the top, cuts through the plastic, and then he's able to paint with effectively a stencil that he's made on the fly as part of the VCarving process. In my experience, VCarving is probably too fine for this, and he had a bit of breakout problems yesterday, which he highlighted. I think the experience we have is you can't. The stencil system is not easy, right? Which means that somehow you've got to clean up after you've painted in the grooves, and the typical way people do that is to sand or resurface the job after they painted it. Okay, that's the other big one. You can also paint the surface first, put the job on, cut through the surface, okay? And my top tip here is that often when you're doing it this way around, you're going to paint the surface perhaps darker and cut through to reveal lighter cuts. So don't forget, you could invert the photograph. Every example I've done today, we have assumed that the photograph is going to have the cuts representing the dark areas in the image, but you can simply invert the photograph. Your cuts will now be over the light areas in the image, and if your surface is dark and your cuts are light, like in my Darth Vader mud mat, then you will still get a really good effect. But don't forget to invert the image, which can be done from the image tool that we pointed out in the beginning of the demo. Then the final way that you can do it is laminated materials. Okay, so you can buy the materials, they've already got laminated layers which are different in color. So there's some examples where you can get plastics with a wood laminate surface, or you can even get MDFs which are colored, multiple colors. Crucial thing here is you've got to obviously know what those thicknesses are. They need to be precise, and you may need to use start depths to break through the laminate material. All of the demos I did here, we assumed the surface was straight into a different color underneath. With laminates, you're going to have to allow for the fact that a laminate has its own thickness, and to get through to the color underneath, you might use the start depth in your photo-vcarv toolpath, and really that is why it's there in part. Okay. The other thing to highlight is to get those accurate widths, you cannot allow the relative depth to be varying for any other reason than deliberately. And that effectively means that your material surface must be perfectly perpendicular to machine's XY cutting plane. And there's various ways of achieving that, as well as just truing up your machine as much as you possibly can and making sure. But you can also make sure you surface the material. That way the material's surface will, regardless of your machine's true axis of movement, be perpendicular relative to the machine movement. I can guarantee it if you surface it first. You can also surface it last and use a start depth. That's quite a good way of doing it, because you can combine that with the painting system that I mentioned, where you can paint into the grooves and then resurface back at the end. The VCarving doesn't care whether you surface at the beginning or the end. The surfacing process will still true up that the exact position where the cuts intersect the surface of your finished part to give you the correct image reproduction. The other thing you can do is use a jig. So in fact, you true up the jig and assume that your materials are flat. And that is really the only option for laminates, where you can't muck around with the surface too much typically. But it is quite effective. We've definitely done this. We schlep a machine around trade shows. It gets walloped. It gets manhandled on and off of trade show benches. So really, the first thing I do when I arrive there on the night before the show is we actually cut effectively a sacrificial bed in the form of a jig into which we can drop the laminated materials, and then that way you get a good relative. Even if you've managed to bend your entire machine, you can still manage to get a pretty good output. So cutting yourself a little sacrificial jig is quite good to drop the thing into as well. Tooling, right? We've touched on the main the issues of how you work out stuff with tooling. How do you decide which tool you're going to use? What angle of tool you're going to use? Well, there's a few things you need to think about. Obviously, what we've seen here is the 90-degree tools. They produce really the biggest line variation with small changes in depth, right? So in fact, they're multiplying it by 2. So any error in depth you see as a line width variation of ×2, right? So think about that. You may need deeper cuts, right? So you may need to use a tool where you're going to deliberately cut deeper because you've got to get through a laminate. So again, going into a steeper angle tool for that. How accurate is your surface leveling? Well, you know, basically, again, because of the magnification of your line width to depth problem, you'll probably find that 60-degree tools will be just that little bit more forgiving, because the line width variation with depth change will just be that little bit less obvious. And of course, obviously, you might be very limited in the depth of cut that you can get away with. So in some cases, you might be cutting into, this system does work on metals if you can get a good inking back against the carving. So you might be cutting into quite thin material where you really can't get away with depth of cut. Then you've got to use a fairly shallow angled 90-degree or even greater tool so that you don't cut through the material. Righto, so in summary, I think these photo VCarve projects have actually a great variety of potential uses in a lot of different sorts of projects. Okay, and I wanted to just bring it up for discussion, but don't get stuck on stripes, right? So stripes are easy, definitely try it out first time round, but the pattern itself can form a very key and crucial part of your project. And so it seems a shame just to waste that bit on striping. And VCarve and Aspire, and in fact all of the Vectric tools are really good at making these carving patterns. You know, this is our bread and butter, and so our tool set's really good at offsetting. It's really good at accurate and reliable creation of these sorts of patterns, and so you're really exercising one of the strongest features of the software. We have built-in vector text creation, which we just talked about. We can use this offsetting system against fairly irregular shapes that are even as bad as text, right? And true type font text is pretty bad in our experience. But don't forget, you can do other stuff. In Becky's demo, as part of the training materials for this strategy, she does a wedding photograph where she uses a heart as the main source of an offsetting pattern out. So make sure, you know, if you can find a thematically linked silhouette, that's really good. And you can get those silhouettes, in fact, even off the source image, perhaps. Projecting the 2D toolpaths is really what VCarve is kind of simplifying for you. The photo VCarve strategy is simplifying for you. But it does mean if you understand it well, you might find other applications for that, where you can just use a profiling toolpath with projection to get similar effects, but with a little bit more power and flexibility. On balance, though, I just hope you found it interesting. Something to experiment with, something to maybe inspire you to try some of these effects for yourself, or maybe think about something related but not quite the same. That's partly what this user group's about, is sparking your creative inspiration and ideas. So I do hope you found that interesting. I will join you again, I think briefly for the closeout tomorrow, but I hope you're all enjoying the UGM so far, and that you will be enjoying the talks later on today and tomorrow, and I'll catch you all then. Thank you very much for listening.